Self-Build and Custom Housebuilding Bill, second reading.
Mr. Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker, it is my honour and pleasure to move the second reading of the Self-Build and Custom Housebuilding Bill, which stands on the order paper in my name. My interest in this area was initially prompted by the fact that I am an MP representing a very rural area in South Norfolk, which has many people, young people, who find it very difficult to get onto the housing ladder or find any place to live when they grow up and leave home. And the idea of being able to stay in the area where they grow up, let alone the village where they grow up near to their parents, is sometimes completely out with the range of possibilities for them in a very rural area with a large number of small villages. Of course, some young people anyway will go off to big cities, in our case to Norwich or to cities in Essex, or indeed to London or elsewhere. But the fact is we don't have enough housing in our rural area. And what's become apparent to me, and would be apparent to anyone taking any notice of the debate across the country, is that the problems of housing are also just as acute in many urban areas, and in some cases the problems are even broader. The issue of unlocking the energy which is latent in the population and deploying it to get more housing is, I think, a very important one, but one which is underestimated. The fact of the matter is that there are many, many millions of people in this country who would like to get a piece of land and to build their own house. The National Custom and Self-Build Association estimates that there are around 1 million people who would like to do this in the next 12 months, and that there are over 7 million people who would like to do it at some point in their lives. But the availability of means to turn this latent desire, this pent-up demand, into something real that actually happens, and that would do a great deal, in my view, to help fulfill the nation's housing needs, have been remarkably lacking. We have a housing market, if we can call it that, that is sclerotic. It is less than 12 months, perhaps slightly more than 12 months now, because I've just returned from the party conference of my party, and 12 months ago when I was at the party conference in Manchester, house builders were still talking about the fact that the housing market was quite fragile. There was no certainty about the recovery. The sector, they said, still needed support and help. And yet, only 2 or 3 months ago, the newspapers were full of stories about a housing bubble. Now, Mr. Speaker, how one can go from near stasis or sclerosis to a housing bubble inside 12 months is quite remarkable. And how that would happen if you had a well-functioning housing market seems to me improbable. The reason it happens is because we do not have a well-functioning housing market. The supply of housing does not rise to meet the demand for housing, and we have a systemic problem. We have a sustained disequilibrium, if you like, to use the jargon, between the people who want houses and the supply of houses. And there are a whole range of very understandable reasons to this, for this, connected with the structure of our planning system, connected with the number of large volume house builders who do a great deal of the provision in this country, and the interplay between those two, and also between those large volume house builders and the capital markets. And the fact is that although we don't have a proper equilibrium, it's no good blaming anybody. I attended the housing supply debate in the summer, moved by the Honourable Lady, the member for Wolverhampton North East. And I have to say I found it a rather appalling, depressing experience, because the first hour or hour and a half of the debate was taken up with essentially honourable members on both sides shouting numbers at each other about who hadn't done what. And it seems to me that shouting numbers isn't really going to get us very far, and indeed announcing targets isn't necessarily going to get us very far. If targets were the answer, then I think we'd have probably solved the problem by now. One of the most interesting facets of public policy in recent years in relation to targets has been the widespread recognition, for example, in policing and in health and indeed in schools, that targets have often made the situation worse, that they have allowed people to game the system. I'm not sure that's quite true in the area of housing, but it's certainly true that there's been a broad recognition in many areas of public policy that if instead of worrying about numbers and setting targets, one instead focuses on removing the blockages which prevent the system flowing smoothly. In other words, to use the term of art coined by John Seddon, the occupational psychologist and management thinker, if we spend more time studying how the work works and attempting to remove the blockages in the flow of how the work works, it is very frequently the case that one gets improvements in performance much, much greater than any target one would have dared to set. And we see this again and again in different parts of local government where we have had some startling successes in performance improvements by taking this approach. Now, people have asked me, were we to have a statutory right to get a piece of land and build a house, would this make any difference? Could you say how much difference it would make? Could you point to a number and say, this is the number of extra dwellings that will be created as a result? And the answer to that, Mr. Speaker, is no, I can't, and I'm not even going to try to, because I think it misses the main point. The main point is that there is an enormous pent-up demand for people who wish to go and get a dwelling of their own and build their own house, and it doesn't have an outlet. The blockages are too severe. And my humble bill, which basically seeks to do two things: to create a register containing information on people who wish to get a piece of land and build a dwelling, individuals and associations of individuals, and then to have local councils have some regard to that register when bringing forward their housing plans, could make quite a significant difference if it were built into the warp and weft of housing plans and local plans of local authorities and became, as it were, part of the new normal. There are a number of other steps that need to happen in parallel in order for it to become part of the normal landscape rather than an activity for an eccentric or highly wealthy fringe, which I'm afraid it is still characterised as being too easily today. I'll come on to say more about the things that need to happen in parallel a little later in my remarks, Mr. Speaker, but I would just say, to re-emphasise this point, we have to take a broader view of the parameters of what could actually be possible in terms of making our housing supply function properly and ensuring that supply can actually rise to meet demand. It's also true that this agenda touches a far broader range of issues than I had at first realised. It's not just about rural areas, it's not just about urban areas, it touches the social cohesion agenda, it touches reoffending, it touches disability. Stella Clark, who runs the Community Self-Build Agency in Bristol, has got young people from ethnic minorities who 10 or 15 years ago would have been rioting, literally building their own stake in the community. She has found a way to help young unemployed people who are in housing need take action themselves to help shape their own futures. Ex-services personnel who, after a life in the forces where they'd always had provided for them the accommodation they needed and who sometimes lose their way when they leave the discipline of a military environment, have been helped in the same way. The front page of the Community Self-Build Agency website quotes a local resident who was helped by the agency. He'd written in as follows: I was encouraged by the local council to apply for the Community Self-Build Agency scheme. I rang them and I said, I'm disabled, unemployed, on benefits, and I know nothing of building. They said, you fit all the criteria. I have never looked back. So I think, Mr. Speaker, we do need to open our eyes to the parameters of what is possible if we unlock the energy of our people. There are many people I need to thank for their help and advice with this bill. First of all, the terrific team which the Minister has at the Department for Communities and Local Government, who have helped me enormously in making my bill technically sound. Ted Stevens, who was until recently the chair of the National Self-Build Association, now called the National Custom and Self-Build Association, and his successor, the new chair, Michael Holmes, and the members and the supporters of the National Association. Ted Stevens was instrumental in a visit which our all-party group on self-build custom build and independent house building. We were looking for a snappy title, Mr. Speaker. By the way, we're going to change it shortly to self-build, custom house building and placemaking, which I wish had done in the first place, to connote the importance of the difference between building boxes on the one hand and making and shaping places and communities with a bit of thought, which actually work as places to live on the other. But Ted Stevens was very instrumental in helping us with a trip we had back in the summer to Berlin to look at what are called Baugruppen, building groups, of which there have now sprung up over 300 in Berlin, delivering over 5,000 dwellings. And I'm delighted to see the Honourable Member for Nottingham North in his place, who came with us on that trip. And we were also accompanied by some very senior officials, right up to Director General level in the Department of Communities and Local Government, and a range of other housing experts from around the country, including from the Scottish Government as well. And it was an extremely enlightening visit. And one of the things that became very apparent was if you allow, and if the local authority, in this case the Berlin Senate, cooperates and encourages activity by people from the bottom up, you can get a surprising range of results, you can get a surprising speed of delivery, and you can do more than is currently done in this country to meet housing need. And I think we could import some of the ideas that we saw in Berlin into this country. I'm conscious of the fact you can't just take a model and lift it across. You have to take account of local circumstances. But the fact is that Baugruppen in Germany have contributed nearly 200,000 dwellings. It's not a small sector. It's quite a significant sector. I had an email from a lady in Yorkshire a few months ago when she heard about my bill saying that she and her husband had been looking for a piece of land for 5 years, and that they were no further forward now than on the day that they started. And she said, it seems as if it will never be in this country for us, as it is in Germany, a middle-aged rite of passage that you can go and get a piece of land and build a house. In Germany, if you want a piece of land, you go along to your local authority and you'd say, I'd like a piece of land, please, because the way the system works there, the land is in the first instance sold by landowners to the local authority. I'm not necessarily saying we need to repeat that here. I don't think that we do. But I'm just telling the story, Mr. Speaker, because I think it's illustrative. You go along to your local authority and you say, I'd like a piece of land, please. And the local authority says, would you like a big one or would you like a small one? And the big ones are slightly disproportionately expensive, and they subsidise the smaller ones, which are slightly disproportionately cheaper. And it is relatively easy to do, and there is no chronic shortage. And this, in a country, as anybody who's been listening to that wonderful Neil McGregor programme on Radio 4 recently about Germany will know, is in a country where a third of the land area is forest. I'm not going to segue into a great soliloquy on the importance of hugging trees and the German soul, because I think that might be out with the bounds of my debate. But the fact of the matter is, there is plenty of land, and you can do it. One of the things that people don't understand, actually, in this country, and I think they really should, and I've dwelt on this, and I've tried my best to get the point across, is how much land we have. Only 1.2% of the land area in this country is taken up with houses. You could double the number of houses in this country, taking up the same amount of land, and we would still have 97.6% of the land in this country that is not houses. Surrey has more land devoted to golf courses than it has to houses, and this is in the rich southeast. These are important facts. I'm not making them up. I have taken these statistics from the Department, official statistics. I've given them to the Daily Telegraph and asked them to publish them. The senior political correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, Christopher Hope, has been running a campaign very successfully for years, pointing out that the wicked Conservatives wish to concrete over England. And sometimes he gets one of his reporters to phone me up. He says, she says, "You're a rural MP. You'll be worried about all this extra housing." I then give them 10 or 15 minutes on why we need more houses. And because they phone me, it's really rather rude for them to put the phone down. So they have to sit and listen. And I know fully well that they won't actually quote me, and they never do. And then I see a quote from somebody else saying, it's disgraceful. There are people who think we should have enough houses for people in this country. It's wicked. The fact that Mr. Hope is my brother-in-law is simply annoying, but I am hoping that at some point I can persuade him to publish the facts about what's going on in this country, because there is this ludicrous dichotomy emerging that either you want to concrete over England, and you don't care about beautiful scenery, or you only care about beautiful scenery and you don't want people to have enough dwellings and you don't want us all to have somewhere to live. I don't know anybody who falls into this category. Most of the people I talk to both love beautiful scenery and want to have somewhere to live. And my belief, my firm belief, is that both are possible. And I hope that my bill is going to make a contribution to making this happen. I haven't finished thanking people because there are yes, of course.
I welcome his bravery in taking on the Telegraph in the form of his brother-in-law. Will you agree with me that according to the National Land Use Database, 5.4% of land is for homes and gardens, and of that, actually in the whole, 1.1% only for the homes themselves. So not only are we not conquering over the countryside, actually we're dedicating a large percentage of that land that is developed to gardens. Yes,
in fact, when I said 1.2% and she said 1.1%, I was referring to the houses. And of course, the gardens take up, I think, another 2 or 3% at least. She's right. It's also true. Railways, I think, take up 2.2%. The fact of the matter, the built environment as a whole takes, if you take up absolutely everything, factories and offices and roads and railways and churches, it's about 9%. So maybe 10%. 89 to 91% of our land area is not built upon. I'm sure there will be a discussion about the Greenbelt. I'm not going to dwell on the Greenbelt for two reasons. One, we don't have any Greenbelt in Norfolk. If you Google Greenbelt images, if you Google images and Greenbelt, you get maps with where the Greenbelt is, and none of it's in Norfolk. We have a huge amount of land in Norfolk, and the Greenbelt is an unfortunate distraction because of the way it's been created. There are places that are not in the Greenbelt, including in my constituency, which I would be horrified to see built upon and which I would sit in front of the bulldozer to prevent being built upon. And there are places which are within the Greenbelt that probably shouldn't be. And I think we need to be more intelligent about that. I think personally the instinct of people to wish to preserve beautiful countryside is a very good one, and I support it completely. The CPRE wrote to me saying, we're interested to hear you've got a bill. We're quite supportive of this sort of approach. You know, you might think that all we're interested in is hugging the trees and protecting the wild animals, but I'm sorry.
I'm grateful because this is one of the things that I too am concerned about, that on my island we don't have any green belt, but lots of people talk of it as if it were green belt, and then they're surprised when building on it is not stopped.
Yes. Well, he's got a very good point. The Isle of Wight is one of the most beautiful parts of the country. I think were we to have a North American approach to zoning, which was much harder edged, and so it were absolutely clear where something ever could or could not be built on, we might make more progress. But that, again, is probably out with the terms of my debate, as indeed is the long discussion about Greenbelt. But it is an important point because it relates to land use and people's deep instincts about land, which I think are very, very sound in many ways. We want to protect beautiful countryside. By the way, as a representative of a very rural area with lots of farmers, we want to keep land to grow food on as well.
Giving way, but I trust he recognises that to a developer, the option between developing a brownfield site which might have industrial waste or contamination and the cost of developing a greenfield site where there is none of that sort of extra cost in developing makes that decision process for the developer much more likely to want to pursue a greenfield green belt option rather than the more challenging industrial brownfield site.
I completely take his point. I would, I suppose, reply with the Irishman, I wouldn't start from here, because the developer is presented with that rather narrow choice in the way he describes. By the way, I should say in passing, it's important to remember, and one of the events I attended at our party conference featured someone from the London Assembly who was trying to get some brownfield sites developed in London for housing and made available for housing, and kept on encountering planners who said, hands off our strategic industrial land, we actually need to keep some brownfield. So it's a more complex and nuanced argument. But the fact is, the problems, and he's absolutely right about the costs of dealing with contaminated land, but in a more fluid and well-functioning world, I think more flowing world, I think the responsibilities that sit within the public realm about making land available that with services that can then be used, and the responsibilities of this is what happened in Victorian times. The local council, the corporation, these great Victorian institutions took it upon themselves to build the infrastructure, the roads, the sewers, goodness, and the fact that they did it so well is the reason it's lasted so long. And we're talking about 100-year-old sewers very often that now need to be replaced through PFI schemes, but the only reason they've lasted so long is because they did such a good job. They went into the market, they issued bonds, and they borrowed the money. The Bolton Corporation, the Corporation of Birmingham, these great Victorian civic institutions, when local authorities had a bit of self-respect, I suppose, and did great work, and then provided the environment in which private individuals could come in and develop, and built many splendid developments that are quite dense, quite high. We see many of them in London and other of our great cities, and which stand still to this day. The problem we have now is that the strategic land promotion is done in a way by the wrong people. It's not so much, and I'm going to come on to volume house builders, but as he's triggered this point, I'm going to mention it now. It's not as if, I don't blame volume house builders for acting in a rational manner. And I think those people who are surprised that volume house builders construct dwellings when and only when it is profitable to do so need to wake up and smell the coffee. Of course that's how they're going to behave. You can't be in the slightest bit surprised that that is how they're going to behave. It's not so much that we encourage them to get in really quickly, do a very quick and in many ways, in terms of its longevity, substandard job, in terms of the quality and durability of what they build, and then get out very quickly. It's not so much as that we encourage them to do that. It's that we require them to do this. They are forced to act in a way that is deeply suboptimal inside a systemically flawed system. So if you go, what we actually need is a much more patient approach to the employment of the capital that's involved. And if you look at some of the ancient estates, not just some of the very old estates in London that have done some of the construction years ago and still own it, or at least still own the freehold of it hundreds of years or many decades later. If you look at the Duchy of Cornwall, now there aren't that many 600-year-old private ducal estates around with the explicit purpose of providing an income for the heir to the throne, but it's been doing its job quite well for 600 years. Go on.
I'm grateful he's being very generous, but surely the ultimate authority is the planning authority, and those local authorities should be much more robust in forcing those developers to consider the brownfield sites before they allow greenfield sites to even be considered. I don't know if his bill assists in any way in trying to free up those sorts of brownfield sites first.
My bill is silent on brownfield sites. The Minister may have something to say about brownfield and greenfield, but the issue... Yes.
Can I firstly congratulate the Honourable Member on his bill, and I'm here to support it. And I hadn't quite anticipated making an intervention about the much bigger issue, about devolution in England, but he's making a very strong case to enable local authorities to have both the independence, the powers and the finance to actually make decisions and judgments as they see fit in their areas, to enable the sort of stuff that we saw in Berlin, which was initiated, I think, just after the Second World War, because of the Berlin local council. That there wouldn't be the marvellous dwellings that we saw were it not for that freedom, liberty and finance. And perhaps I can draw him, providing he doesn't go out of order, into that argument about freeing up local authorities to get on with some of this stuff.
He makes a very interesting point, and this is a broad and deep issue. The fact of the matter is that many planners who go into the planning profession do so because they are driven by a desire to help shape community and to provide better places for us to live, that work as places to live. And when they get into a local authority with the extraordinarily complex planning environment that they operate in, and I commend the government for having sized away hundreds and hundreds of pages of planning law, which was necessary so that an ordinary lay person could read it and have some hope of understanding it. But when they get into this environment, they suddenly find that instead of being able to help shape community and think logically, they are the person who says no the whole time. And they don't like being the person who says no the whole time, so very often the good ones leave. And this is a dreadful caricature, because I think it's not true that the only ones who are left are the malign and the mediocre. But I think, Mr. Speaker, you get the point I'm making. Some of the people who go into it with the best of motives end up leaving. I've met such people who say, when I present that caricature, they say, yes, I used to be one of those people. I found I couldn't do anything. And if you think about where the planning authority power sits, my local district council is the council tax raising authority and the planning authority. 1p on the council tax for it is only about £60,000. The idea that they are going to be able to stand up to a large developer, there's an enormous asymmetry of power, which means that they can't take the rounded decisions in a responsible and representative way on behalf of the people whom they govern locally, in the way that I'd like, and I think he would like to see them do. Once again, however, I fear that reforming the whole of local government and making it flow and function as it should is probably out with the terms of my bill. But I was talking about patient capital and about the Duchy of Cornwall. Now, if you go down to Poundbury in Dorchester, it's an urban extension of Dorchester, and I did this last year and again this summer. We went to the committee last year, the Public Accounts Committee, and when we were looking at the Duchy of Cornwall, but I went again this year with a number of colleagues. And what's interesting about it actually is not the Georgian pastiche, which I think is like sugar in your tea. There are some people who like it and some people who don't. I happen to think if it's well done, and some of it there is extraordinarily well done, that it's rather good, and it's built to a very high standard. If you stand near the farmhouse there, and there's some of the oldest, maturest developments there that have been there for nearly 20 years by the very mature trees, you would swear you were in Islington or Camden from 150 years ago, and people like it and they want to live there. But the really interesting thing is not that. The really interesting thing is that they are now 21 years into a 33-year project, and the fact is that they've already accomplished, last year they'd done over 1,000 dwellings and 1,600 jobs. Now they've done 1,200 dwellings and over 2,000 jobs. Their target for 33 years was only just over 2,000 jobs. They've already reached their target of nearly 2,200 jobs in two-thirds of the time. And the dwellings are becoming more and more attractive. And the most fascinating thing is that when firms like Barratt build there and are allowed to build there, A, they have to build to a very, very tight design code, but B, they pay a premium for the land compared with what they pay elsewhere. And on the surrounding land belonging to different landowners, there is a halo effect because people look at it and they say, "Whoa, I'd like some of that." So instead of getting the boxes on the green field at the edge of the town, which are easier and cheaper to do than the brown field, which my honourable friend was talking about earlier, you get something that where the value of the last house that gets built is actually higher than the value of the first house that gets built, which is very rarely the case in most of the big volume house building developments that we see. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to make a bit of progress and try and whiz through finally the rest of my thank you list, because I would actually like quite soon to get on to the substance of my bill, which, because it's such a humble little bill, will I hope not take too long. Lord Richard Best of the President of the Local Government Association has been enormously helpful and supportive to me, as have a group called Housing People Building Communities in Liverpool, who have an award-winning self-build project on land provided by the Roman Catholic Diocese. I've recently met with the Bishop of Rochester, James Langstaff, who leads for the Church of England on land and property, and who is hoping to help link up the dioceses across England with the vanguard councils that were recently announced by the Department for Communities and Local Government. The National Housing Federation have also been amazingly helpful and supportive. They have their November campaign. I'm sure, being at the cutting edge of technology, the Minister will be aware that the 12th of November is hashtag Housing Day. I am even more impressed by their December Christmas campaign, which is Ho Ho Homes for Britain, which I think somebody should probably get an award for, even if it's only a bar of chocolate.
The honourable gentleman is indulging in what I think I can accurately describe as preliminary dilation. But if it's of any encouragement or succour to him, I have the very keen sense that the House is enjoying his preliminary dilation. And I'm a little alarmed by the thought that he might, as he put it, whiz through the rest of his remarks. I don't think we would want him to do that. Mr. Richard Bacon.
Speaker, I did have a fear that this would be more like Oscar Peterson than J.S. Bach, and so it is proving. But I will come to the conclusion of my thank you list, because I do want to move on.